Martin Lawrence was involved in the creation of Spotify?
I was like, Martin!
And so now I have this like alternative creation story of Spotify in which Martin Lawrence pulled the strings. Hey, I'm Sam Sanders. Thank you for checking out my show. This week, I'm going to talk about Spotify. I'm guessing if you are like me, Spotify is a big part of your life. You listen to it kind of all day. Music or podcast or background noise or whatever. For most of us, I think we kind of believe that Spotify has just made our lives easier. But my guest this week argues that Spotify, pound for pound, on the whole, hasn't been great for music as an art form. She has a whole book about it. I have the book here. It's very pretty. It is called Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. The author's right here. Liz Pelly, hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm so glad we were able to work this out. Since I discovered your book was coming out, I wanted to get you, and we had to wait until you got to L.A., and you're here. There's so much in the book that I want to unpack, but I want to talk about a phrase you use that really just stuck to me and gave me pause and made me kind of scared. You said that Spotify makes us treat music, quote, more as a utility than an art form. That sounds bleak. What do you mean by that?
I think that this is a turn of phrase that a lot of different critics and researchers have used over the years, either to argue like for or against this concept. But I think when people talk about the way in which streaming has centered this idea or put forth this idea of music as a utility, it's like, think about the concept of the stream or, like the water that you put on in your house or something. You just like turn on the tap and it flows out.
About it.
And,
On
don't
demand.
really think about it very much. Although there's lots of reasons to think about, for example, the water coming out of your sink in your house. So I think it's kind of like that. It's like, we're thinking about it as this subscription or this utility, like a bill that you get, and, it just covers this thing that then becomes sort of like, something you don't think about very much.
Well, it's often background noise. Like, I find that, and you lay this out in the book, there was a version of listening before the rise of the playlist and the algorithm and on-demand streaming, where you had to be pretty picky and selective about what you listened to, and you had to make a choice. In the era of CDs, you went and bought that CD, you thought about the artist, you put it on, you listened to it, knowing that you were listening to that artist. And in this era of Spotify with music as a utility, you can put on a playlist that plays for hours in which you never know the name of a single artist. Is that the kind of utilitification that you're talking about here?
Yeah, totally. I think a lot of it also has to do with this idea of the feed, and it's not like this has only impacted music, but in a lot of ways, other types of information that we receive every day in our lives now through digital platforms and recommendation algorithms and news feeds. It's like this idea that instead of actively going and seeking out the music or other media that you want to consume, you're thinking about these personalized feeds, delivering it to you, and just kind of like, getting like washed over by this feed of information.
Well, and then, here's the thing. You allude to this idea that we can trust the algorithm, we can trust the feed, it will be given to us, it will wash over us, and we can say that we assume the bargain is with Spotify. You get my information on my listening, and then you feed me things that are tailored to me and curated to me. But so much of what your book details is how it's not that simple and it's not that altruistic. Two big things you report on, and others have as well. One, artists can now accept lower royalty rates in exchange for showing up more in people's feeds and on playlists. And then two, some of the music that we hear on Spotify is made by quote unquote ghost artists. That kind of blew my mind the most. This idea that it's not just that we're getting ambient music noise fed to us in perpetuity. Some of it is like less real than we think. What is ghost music? It's kind of wild.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you picked out those two threads in the book together too, because the book that I wrote is I usually describe it as a work of reported criticism, where there
Yeah.
definitely is this aspect of it where it's cultural criticism and
Yeah.
there's a perspective being put forth, but there's also a dimension to it that's investigative. And the
Oh, yeah.
two sort of investigations that I feel like really ground it are this investigation into what I refer to as ghost artists, and then this investigation into new types of payola-like practices in the streaming era.
Yeah.
And I think that they're connected in a lot of ways because both of them are examples of new practices that have become popular in the streaming era. Specifically, I'm looking at these types of practices internally at Spotify, where the user or the streaming listener is being recommended certain tracks
Mm-hmm.
that are being recommended to them because of some sort of pre-existing commercial relationship, and it's not made clear to them that
This
that's
is
the
the thing.
case.
Well, because
You know?
Spotify has kind of pitched to us that it is a digital democracy and meritocracy,
Mhm.
and the good stuff rises to the top, and the stuff people want to hear is what rises to the top. When in actuality,
Mhm.
there's money at play, there's business at play, and there's a sleight of hand at play.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the past few years, you've seen different sort of seasons on social media where people are sort of like, you know, kind of conspiracy theorizing about why certain pop acts are ending up on
Industry
their
plant.
playlist and yeah, industry plant, blah, blah, blah. And, sometimes some of it is kind of like overblown, but I think that people are right in this moment to sort of be questioning I have been recommended this piece of music. Why have I been recommending it? Why have I been recommended it?
Why
Are
is
there
Espresso by Sabrina
Yeah.
Carpenter showing up on my death metal playlist?
Yeah, that's kinda what I was thinking of, and, like, I can't speak confidently about the specific terms of why, espresso might have been on a death metal playlist, but I can say that I think it makes sense that we're in a moment where people are really questioning, like, what are the commercial deals influencing my streaming recommendations, and, is there more at play that
Yeah,
streaming services aren't being fully transparent about because there's a lot that they're not being fully
exactly.
transparent about.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you asked about the ghost
Let's talk
artist
about the ghost artist. So
mhm,
I think it's pretty easy to explain artists taking lower rates of royalties to be promoted more on Spotify. That tracks. Okay, I get it.
mhm,
But as soon as I say ghost artist and ghost music, I'm sure a lot of our audience is like, "Huh?" Like,
mhm.
what exactly is that clinically?
Yeah. So for a really long time in the music business, trade press, and on social media, when I was working on this book around 2022, 2023, and at
Hmm.
that point for years there had already been articles in the trade press, headlines like Spotify's filling its playlists with fake artists in genres like jazz, classical, ambient, lo-fi hip hop
Which is so
beats.
wild to me because there's an endless and infinite amount of classical and jazz music to put on playlists.
Exactly.
Like, come on
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Mozart is right there. Coltrane is right there.
Yeah, and like lo-fi hip hop beat makers and ambient music, like, there's no shortage of current
Yeah.
independent musicians trying
Just
to
the
figure out
catalog of MF Doom instrumentals is
mhm.
all you need to study by for years. Sorry, I keep interrupting you. Go
No,
ahead.
it's great though. Like there's so many artists that come to mind in these traditions that you think would be, doing really well in this era because there are so many people looking to streaming services for instrumental music to
Yeah.
listen to in the background.
Yeah.
And so these headlines started circulating that Spotify, some of the headlines were claiming that Spotify was creating this music themselves, that they were creating fake artists. And even early on, Spotify was
Like,
pretty
not
quick
quite.
to say, we're not making these artists ourselves.
Yeah.
But they never denied the existence of some broader arrangement, which
Hmm.
I think, made a lot of people curious.
Yeah. Well, and like, it kind of like, refresh me, but like in the book, you detail how it's like there'll be these musicians who write a lot, produce a lot, make their own stuff, but they'll like do a session and record a bunch of songs that feel very similar. Often Spotify says, make them sound like this. Then they make a bunch of songs all at once. They take a flat fee and they sign off all the royalties. And then Spotify gets to promote that music and pay out less for it. And they often have a name on this music that is not the actual name of the people who made it.
Mhm. Yeah, that's like basically tracks. The one thing I would point out being that though, so um, it's not necessarily like Spotify directly commissioning the music from them,
Huh.
but so Spotify has a list of licensors that it works with
Mm-hmm.
under these specific terms
So
and
ghost labels.
conditions. Yeah, exactly. They're like stock music labels, production companies, and then those companies in turn commission the music from the artists and composers who are, like you said, kind of, I got the chance to interview some of the musicians making this material, who work with some of these specific production companies and stock music agencies that have contracts with
Mm-hmm.
Spotify. And uh, the artists I spoke with, has told me things like, yeah, I just make the tracks, crank out a bunch of them in a session,
Yeah.
submit them, get paid. I'm not really sure what happens after that. And it's really interesting because, for years, people on social media would, for example, be posting these playlists saying things like, I just was listening to the study playlist on Spotify and I noticed that all of the album art looks like it was made with generative AI and
Huh.
none of these artists have bios. And
Uh-huh.
I tried to Google these musicians
And
and
you
I can't find
can't.
any information about any of them.
Wow.
And, maybe these artists seem like they might be fake. And it would often be like, Spotify curated study playlists or sleep playlists or things like that.
Huh.
So there's a lot of curiosity and sort of confusion about this practice
Yeah.
in the trade press, amongst people online who use Spotify, amongst music journalists for years. And while I was reporting the book, I knew it was something that I would have to look into.
Yeah.
At first, though, the first article that I ever wrote about Spotify came out in 2017. And when it
Wow.
came out, almost immediately, people who worked at independent record labels started emailing me
What were
saying
they
things
saying?
like, they were like, great article, but you really should investigate this whole fake artist thing on Spotify.
Really? So
So,
even as far back as 2017, there were
yeah.
questions about fake artists on Spotify.
Yeah. So,
Ah.
this kind of narrative had been around for a while. And one of the reasons why in my book I specifically wanted to refer to them as ghost artists, not
Mm-hmm.
fake artists, is
It's
because
people.
exactly. Yeah. So by
It's
the
not AI yet.
exactly. Yeah. So while I was working on the book, it was kind of like I was sort of writing my book under the cloud of the generative AI discourse playing out.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, make sure that people realize that, at least in what I observed in my research and what I was able to kind of lift the veil on, was not necessarily a practice of playlists being pumped with generative AI music, although I definitely think that's something that we
It's in
need
the
to sort
future,
of,
Yeah.
take. Beware of. But what I found was, yeah, this practice of the music being commissioned from these production agencies, um,
Yeah.
but from actual
Yeah.
composers.
So there's another angle here that I hadn't thought about until I read it in your book. So let's take, for instance, there's a study jazz playlist, and Spotify commissions a ghost label to have ghost artists make a bunch of just study jazz tracks. They're not making jazz. They're making the version of jazz that Spotify wants for a study playlist,
Mhm.
which means that often they will tell these jazz musicians who have studied a very complex art form
Mhm.
called jazz,
Uh-huh.
they'll tell them, don't make it too complex.
Yeah.
Don't make it too hard. Don't make it too stimulating because it needs to be background music. And in fact, there's a name for this. It's called Spotify core. I didn't know this. Spotify core. Like the kind of music that Spotify has come to be known for is like the forgettable background coffee shop, you're studying or going to sleep music.
Yeah. Yeah. So Spotify Core, I think, well, it's interesting because when I think of Spotify Core, I think more of sort of like the type
Lo-fi
of
beats.
pop music
Okay.
actually
Oh, okay.
that was starting to become popular in the sort of like mid to late 2010s, in this sort of era where the Spotify playlist had this kind of unique cultural weight. It's sort of pop music that would do well on a sort of like pop chill or like
Yeah. Or like
sad
start your
girl.
morning right with coffee playlist or
Kind of like
something.
that, yeah. Whereas when I think about the ghost artist phenomenon and the ways in which composers are, being pushed or nudged in certain directions to make music that would work well in these instrumental background
Mhm.
playlists, I think way more of instrumental music. So it
Gotcha.
is interesting though, because there are
Okay.
certain ways in which the mechanisms of playlists and the sort of championing of background music in new ways or passive listening or what the industry calls functional music. So
Oh my God, that's
music
bleak. Functional music.
yeah, so
Ugh.
that's like a term that the industry I feel like has really embraced in the streaming era, which is kind of like music to do yoga to, music for studying, music for sleeping, music for working out
Mm-hmm.
or to accompany some sort of activity.
Mm-hmm.
But really interesting, like something I try to make clear in my book is that a lot of these practices are long running industry practices.
Huh.
Like functional music, for example, is how the Muzak Corporation referred
Yeah.
to its product offering in
Yeah.
the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah.
So, like, there's kind of, um, it's not completely new, but what is sort of new is that you have all of this type of music that historically has kind of existed in different contexts for different purposes that's sort of all being thrown on the same platform, the same
As
economic
Beyonce and Taylor
arrangement.
Swift and Drake. It's all in the
Yeah.
same milieu. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. They're all expected to sort of like make sense of the same economic arrangements and the same recommendation systems and
Yeah.
things. When historically, like the way in which Muzak was created, packaged, and sold would have been completely different from the way in which, any other type of
Yeah.
music was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking about this phenomenon in Spotify, the rise of Spotify core music, the rise of ghost artists, this like generating content that is meant to be just like functionally passive for a user. I was like, oh, is this already happening in other media spaces as well? I think about TikTok a lot.
Mm. Mhm.
A few weeks ago, I started to get every few videos computer generated pimple popping videos with
No.
like music under it. And I'm
Whoa.
like, a computer made all of this.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, is this just like a different version of what Spotify is doing?
Yeah, I mean, like these platforms have created incentive for various types of media makers and companies and spam bots and
Oh,
like
yeah.
spammers to just create uh the cheapest content possible
And
that
the
people
stuff
will
that will
stream.
just most passively get you to not hang up.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a dynamic of I think media creation and media consumption that isn't unique to just music and streaming.
Yeah.
Like people talk about slop as kind of this thing that is being incentivized right now. Like all of these different platforms are sort of incentivizing um, companies or individuals to just generate whatever kind of
Things that are bad on purpose. Yeah.
whatever AI generated slop will get streams,
Mm-hmm.
or plays, or that you could put ads
Yeah.
alongside. Um, yeah, there's this writer Cory Doctorow who coins this
Oh, yeah.
term,
Inshitification.
inshitification or platform decay, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that all of those terms are pretty interesting and useful.
Yeah.
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 Mhm.
So then we're talking about how Spotify might be degrading the music we hear on the platform, how it might be using music by quote unquote ghost artists that hurts the kind of money that the real artist can see because every spin that goes to a ghost artist is not going to a real artist.
Yeah.
Then we know historically that the compensation rate for artists on Spotify is really low.
Mhm.
I read somewhere recently that like a million streams might maybe get you 10 grand. Maybe.
Mm.
Knowing all of this and how the cards are stacked against the average artist who is on a platform like Spotify, why haven't the musicians unionized yet?
Yeah.
Because
It's
the record labels have their stuff in order. They're making money. They're profitable again.
mhm.
Spotify has their money in order. Their head made over $300 million last year. Why aren't the musicians themselves organizing?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question and an important one. And, yeah, just also to be totally clear, because we were talking about the consequences of ghost artist content. And I feel like also, like you mentioned, should point out all of the consequences that this practice has for musicians themselves and the musicians that have for over a decade now kind of tried to figure out how to navigate these new landscapes and connect meaningfully with audiences and piece together revenue streams. But the question of unionizing or organizing is really important. In my book, I spend a chapter towards the end looking at some new types of groups that have emerged in recent years. I talk about this group called United Musicians and Allied Workers, which is one sort of solidarity organization that was created in 2020 by a bunch of DIY musicians self-organizing to try to foster a sense of solidarity and work together to sort of try to unpack some of these issues. I also talk about this organization called Music Workers Alliance, which is New York based and takes on similar issues of justice in the digital domain. And I make reference to campaigns led by other musicians unions around the world, like the UK Musicians Union. But in the United States, it's really complicated because most independent musicians are considered independent contractors or freelancers. So there's actually a lot of legal reasons
They
for
aren't
why.
employed by the labels, actually.
Right. Yeah. So it totally depends on the contract,
Yeah.
or whether terms are kind of different for some major label artists versus independent artists. But for independent artists, because they're independent contractors, there are laws prohibiting them from collective bargaining
Oh,
or from
really?
organizing.
Huh.
Yeah. I mean, there various industry advocates will tell you that there are laws in the United States that make it so that independent musicians organizing could be at risk for being considered an illegal cartel.
What?
Yeah, so that's like
Wow.
language that you'll hear often when talking about the reasons why independent musicians don't organize more. But
Huh.
there is this piece of legislation right now called the Protect Working Musicians Act, which is sort
hmm
of attempting to change that for
Yeah.
musicians. So there are, various different policy interventions that arise when you talk about all of these issues of the streaming era, because there's lots of different ways of thinking about how you might start to contend with all of this corporate
Yeah.
consolidation and impacts on artists,
hmm
and of the many different ways that you could think about trying to offer a solution. I think one piece of the puzzle is these various like
Yeah.
policy interventions.
Yeah. I have been thinking for years about how Spotify has been changing music. And I had a conversation with some musicologists a few years ago when Spotify playlists were king about how getting on the Spotify playlist had changed the way songwriters wrote their songs.
Hmm.
So, for instance, Spotify values songs more if a listener plays through the whole track, which means that artists began to make their songs shorter. Which means that when I was a kid, the average pop hit was 3.5 minutes long. Now, in the era of Spotify, it's 2.5 minutes long. I've had other conversations that talk about how this new era of short, quick, get to a hook music means that traditional building blocks of a pop song are gone. Bridge, like a song's bridge might be gone, a song's vamp might be gone. And it's just like verse, chorus, get in, get out, make it simpler. And then now we're talking about how the rise of Spotify as this ambient utility giving you background noise for your day is cheapening the craft in some other ways, having jazz artists make jazz that isn't offensive or complex. Knowing all of these things are happening, as someone who studies it, do you think it's fair to say, would you say that pound for pound, Spotify has been bad for music as an art form?
That yeah, great question. I mean,
Yes or no?
I think that well, something that I think I should say is that
Yes.
something that I try to make clear in the book is that a lot of the
Yes.
criticisms of Spotify made in the book are kind of using Spotify as an entry point into criticisms of the streaming model more broadly.
Yeah.
So I think if I were to answer that question, I would definitely say like maybe it's more useful to think about the impacts of streaming on culture, not just
Gotcha.
like specifically Spotify.
Okay.
Although, like, Spotify is the most
They're the biggest
popular
one.
streaming service
Yeah.
and they kind of normalize this
So then
model
same
in a lot of
question
ways.
for all
Yeah,
of
but all of
streaming.
streaming. Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the context, right? Because music is so vast and there's so
Mm-hmm.
many different reasons why people make music
Mm-hmm.
and different types of artists interface with these systems in different ways. But I don't think that it has necessarily created conditions that have really allowed the vast majority of musicians to feel like, supported in
Mm-hmm.
more uh, following their creative impulses in really kind of curious and like boundary pushing ways or whatever.
Yeah.
Like I think it really depends on the musician too, right? Because I think there are plenty of artists who um
Spotify's
uh
great for Drake. It's great for him, you know?
yeah, or I think there's plenty of artists who figure out how to successfully kind of like insulate themselves from the noise and the pressures that all of the data presents. But I do
Mm.
think there's a sort of songwriter for whom like, maybe they're not necessarily thinking about taking in all of the data that they're being presented with every day. And then, like something that I talk about in the book is how there's this Spotify for Artists dashboard where musicians get
Mm-hmm.
access to all of this different data on their music.
That would
Like,
freak me the hell out.
yeah, and I actually think, all types of creative people or people who make things are dealing with similar um, influences or pressures of the
Mm-hmm.
platform economy. Even like, with being a writer or a podcaster and seeing like all of the different data that you're presented with
It's
from
wild.
like
I can
this
see trend lines
Substacks.
in the conversation of when it goes up or down.
Right?
It's
Isn't that
insane.
so interesting?
Yeah.
Like I've had this conversation with some podcasters how, similarly to the way musicians are sort of trying to figure out navigating all this data that they're kind of like
Mm-hmm.
constantly being shown about like which song is performing best, which songs have
Mm-hmm.
the highest completion rates, which songs
Yeah.
get skip rates. Like, oh, like this song on the album did really well. Like,
How
should
can I
I make
duplicate
more
it?
songs that sound like this?
Yeah.
I think that a lot of people, that's kind of why in the book I refer to it as stream bait. Because if you think about it, like a lot of the dynamics that musicians are dealing with in this sort of stream bait era are kind of similar to what journalists were faced with in the
The
clickbait
clickbait
era,
era. And
know?
it is this pressure to deviate towards a mean that will go viral.
Mhm.
And this is what scares me.
Yeah.
When you have artists seeing their Spotify dashboard that tells them who likes what songs and how and when they stop listening, do you then end up with artists pound for pound making less creative music and more music that deviates to the mean of what they know works?
Mhm.
If we live in an era where musicians are informed by data to the T on how all of their songs perform, does that mean they end up making more interesting music or making less interesting music?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely feel like, following the data, like you mentioned to a T, like leads to less interesting
It
music
leads to
for
like
sure.
73 versions of
Yeah.
espresso.
Yeah. I feel like, there's part of me that like tries to like not make big sweeping statements like,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
this has been bad
Yeah.
for culture or something, but I don't think that it's necessarily been good for culture. And I do think that like if you think about the logic, like platform logic
Yeah.
being imposed on musicians, if it is followed, and I think there's a few examples I try to paint in the book of like um, situations like this and just like the confusion that it
Yeah. Totally.
creates for artists. It's definitely not like it's antagonistic to art is how I describe it.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
It's funny having this part of the chat with you. I keep thinking about how there was this study done, and several studies done at this point, on TikTok,
Mm.
and how TikTok is very good at recognizing faces
Mm.
and what faces people like the most. What it led to was a default face, and it's angular in a certain way. It's not quite white. It's not quite Asian. It's extremely symmetrical, and it's inoffensive. And so, what all the data that TikTok got about the human face, all that data didn't lead to a higher diversity of faces on TikTok. It led to a deviation to a norm
Mm-hmm.
of faces on TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm scared that that can happen musically
Yeah.
on Spotify.
Totally. I mean, like, there's this quote from this one person from an independent record label who I interviewed in my book who just says, I am afraid of all music starting to sound the same. And
Yes,
I think that,
that.
yeah, that quote definitely really stuck with me because I think it's interesting point for sure. And I think that in a lot of ways, that's kind of, uh, it's sort of what artists are up against, I think, is
Mm,
like, a type of platform logic that wants to like smooth
mhm.
everything out, that wants everything to like fit in these neat boxes. It's not too dissimilar from the ways in which the sort of rigid boundaries of genre of the past kind of like,
Kept
imposed
you in a lane.
certain,
Yeah.
yeah, like kept you in a box or something. And that's what's so like, there's been a lot of kind of um, another sort of myth of the streaming era is this idea that streaming has helped usher in this sort of genreless era of music. But in a lot of ways, I think what it has done is sort of like kind of just smoothed out a
You
lot
use the word
of,
flattened in the book.
yeah, yeah, it's kind of been like a
Yeah.
flattening, I think.
Ugh,
Yeah.
flattened. Okay, so then, okay, we have set up how, gosh, Spotify can sometimes be just not great for art and not great for the artist. A lot of folks are going to be listening to this podcast on Spotify.
Mhm.
What should they, as consumers of this product, be doing differently if they care about the problems that we've introduced in this chat?
Yeah. I think, it's because of like what I said earlier, music being so vast and so many people are having different relationships with music. Musicians make music for different reasons. Like why people turn to music is so different. The answer to this question, and I even write in the book that my answer to this question is often sort of like unsatisfying because there's certainly not one kind of like push this button and
And you
everything will
fix it.
be
Yeah.
fixed or make this one decision and you'll be like an ethical consumer or something. It's kind of like I definitely feel like it's bigger than that. But yeah, there are a lot of things that I think firstly is kind of there's a deep sense of sort of resignation that people have
Mm,
about streaming, similar to kind of other platforms that I think people start to sort of view as like necessary evils or
mm-hmm.
something. And I think that pushing back on that from my perspective is really important because if you really care about music and music is something that want to if you want to support the musicians who make the work that is really
Mm-hmm.
meaningful to you, there are direct ways that you could do that. There's kind of like I think of it both in terms of there's like the collective solutions and then there's like what you can do as an individual. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's important to think about both because the problems raised by streaming are such like big systemic issues that
Mm-hmm.
sometimes pointing to these more individualistic solutions can
It's
feel a
not the
little bit
fix. Yeah.
shallow. At the same time, it is kind of
It's something.
something. So, like, uh, even if you keep your streaming service, like also buying music directly from artists, whether it be directly through their websites or through Bandcamp or merch at a show,
Mm-hmm.
having your own library of music that you maintain in addition to like whatever other ways that you stream it. There's not like one point in the book where I say everyone should delete their accounts because I'm a really big believer that calls for boycotts should come from like organized groups of artists and unions and not from
Mm-hmm.
individuals. And also because I also think that kind of I'm sort of more focused on what people like do as opposed
Yeah.
to kind of what they don't do.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, like supporting the music that you want to see thrive in the world. So
Yeah.
like buying music directly from artists, supporting independent record labels, supporting independent music retail, independent record stores, going to shows. And then it's also, I think, another way you could think about it is streaming was sort of pitched not just as a replacement for the record store as a
Mm-hmm.
way to sort of monetize music, but
Mm-hmm.
it also has kind of emerged as a different way of thinking about how people discover music and contextualize it.
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of simultaneously pitched as this answer to radio and the record store. So also
Yeah.
thinking about um, the independent, like the media that you consume as well. Like
Yeah.
not just in terms of how do you get money into the pockets of musicians, but also how do you discover music. And I think that
One could even listen to a radio station that has DJs who hand curate the songs you hear.
absolutely,
That's a thing that could be done.
that is a
As a matter of
thing.
fact, there's one. What is the name of that station?
Yeah, can you think of any? Oh, cool. Yeah.
Damn, that's wild. Speaking of,
Yeah.
I have a surprise. I was like, I can have a lot of questions for this author of this incredible Spotify expose book, but I'm just a music listener and lover, former music major, but that's neither here nor there. I said to myself, wouldn't this chat be enriched even more if we had someone in the booth with us who has experienced Spotify affecting her career directly? I'm talking about a DJ, my favorite DJ. Her name is Novena Carmel. She works with me here at the station. And I figured the three of us could talk for a bit about how Spotify has affected her and her livelihood.
That sounds great.
Shall we do that?
I'd love to.
Okay. Through the magic of internet, in a second, she'll be here. All right. We're back on the show talking about Spotify and if she's bad or good. But for the first time ever, through the magic of the folks in the control room, we manifested a third guest.
Aw.
Yeah. Novena Carmel, hello, how are you?
I'm wonderful. This is wild. Thanks for
Wild.
inviting me to be
Oh my
here.
God, of course. Tell folks who you are.
Well, I'm Novena Carmel.
Yeah.
And I am a host and DJ here at KCRW. And generally, I like to describe myself as a music person.
You work with music. You hand curate playlists.
Hmm.
How do you feel emotionally when you hear that conversation? Are you scared? Are you angry? Is it something else? Like, how do you feel about all these things that we talked about in the book?
I feel like a number of the things, when I first hear them, it's like shocking and it scares me. But then I start thinking about the bigger picture and also like the past of music.
Huh.
And I think that if you just like keep your mind in like the streaming world, it can seem daunting and scary. But then I think about, one of the things that was brought up was like the homogenization of music, right?
Yeah.
Like everything is sounding the same. And I'm like, in the 60s, all the music that was being released sounded the same. It wasn't like, there was
Motown was
cool
like, let's do it
indie
this way.
people.
Yeah.
It's like, I think that's kind of the nature of like popular music and what spreads the most. And then even like your TikTok example of the faces being scanned and then it like responds to that and only shows you those faces. Well, TikTok, that's in the TikTok world, and TikTok is a wholly new thing. It's not like reusing something that already exists, really. It's
Yeah.
very TikTok-y.
Yeah.
Spotify is playing music. Music has existed for hundreds of years. It's different to me, you know?
Okay.
And I think also the nature of being an artist, like a true artist, is not wanting to, a lot of people don't want to sound the same or fit any formula. They've had opportunities to do that for decades in many different scenarios. I think that there will always be people who are more like commercial or formulaic in every category, whether it's music or even visual art. Like I started thinking about how you can like buy very like generic art for any space, like a hotel or your home or whatever, live, laugh, love, or even like, a drawing of a scenery that I think there's artists even that just kind of pump
Crank
those
that
out.
Yeah.
That are not like, I'm an artiste and I'm indie or whatever. They're just like, let me make money doing this. So I didn't really feel worried in that regard. I think that that's always happened and it always will. And I think music is something that is inherent to being human. And so it will always exist. Like you can't kill music.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
It's very interesting hearing you say that because before I walked in today, I was like, this is going to rile Novena up. She's going to be ready to march on Spotify offices. You're less worried than me.
Yeah. I feel the most worried about artists and their livelihood. That's the thing that worries me consistently. And, I think about Spotify capturing people's attention and their money in a way where it's not like being given to the artist, like we were just talking about. But I'm not worried about music still being made because I think even people will make it even if it's not their main job.
Okay.
And I think that there will always be interesting art in any category of art, just because like not everybody that exists making that art wants to do something that's formulaic.
There you go.
Hmm.
Hearing Novena's response to that, how does it stack up to what industry insiders say to you? Like when you gauge the temperature of folks that work in music and their thoughts on Spotify, are they sounding like Novena? Are they sounding more optimistic, more pessimistic? Like, how scared are folks in the industry?
I think it really depends who you're talking to because, like,
Okay.
even within the music industry, there's lots of people who work in music for lots of different reasons. There's plenty of people who work in music who don't care about music, and there's plenty of people
I
who
love how you
work
whispered it.
in music who are really passionate about
Yeah.
music and who have that sort of broader cultural context and like understanding of what music is for. Like, if you talk to different people who work in music, they all have different reasons for understanding like music's purpose or
Yeah.
like different conceptions of that.
Yeah.
I think that, like you mentioned, there have always been commercial pressures on artists and different opportunities for artists to sort of pursue them or not pursue them depending on their goals or like, their convictions or et cetera. I think in some ways, like the work of kind of interrogating a company like Spotify is just sort of as much as it is showing practices that are new, like all this data collection and surveillance, and maybe like new ways in which artist compensation is changing. But it's also, I think, a way of showing very old industry practices and dynamics that have existed in the music industry for decades and decades and decades and showing new manifestations of them. And for people who come to music, especially from like more of an independent background or more of like a pro artist background, I think hopefully what is useful about it is showing the new types of ways in which power is being consolidated in music. And in some ways, it's sort of like, oh, yeah, like this is what we're up against in some ways, or this is like what we have to offer an alternative to in some ways. And I think, I don't know, it's super interesting. Like, I do think that we talked a lot about the type of music being made, the pressures on artists, but there's also a whole other aspect of the conversation about how streaming is affecting music that has to do with the discovery of music and the curation of music and the sort of rise of algorithmic personalized feeds. And like, for example, in the past few years, Spotify has been rolling out this feature called AI DJ, which is like, this one button that you can press on the app.
And he's so corny.
It's so corny.
AI, one of the biggest insults or most biting insults I've ever heard in my life sent to me. Somebody told me that they think the AI DJ on Spotify sounds like me. I wanted to physically fight them. I wanted to physically fight them. Anywho, cut you off. I'm sorry. As you were, continue.
No, it's just super interesting because in some ways, I think it really kind of hopefully, like for lots of us in music, hearing about the practices of a company like Spotify or like remembering the sort of like goals of a tool like AI DJ, it kind of like reminds us like what our motivations are, like, what our purpose is. It's like, okay, like, what does it actually mean to offer an alternative to that? And like, what does it mean to contextualize music in a way that is more meaningful than just like presenting someone some recommendations based on their listening history?
Exactly.
It's like,
No, I think the context is just really good to have. And one of the things that I was thinking of is sometimes I find artists on Spotify that are suggested to me, and I will play them on air on my radio show. And I was like, oh my God, don't let me discover a ghost artist and then play them.
And how would you even know though? It's so scary.
Well, I look into them usually a bit, but I
Yeah.
mean, I'm like, to what extent could this go? They could have like a website. Who knows? I don't know, like to what, So that alone, the context of that was like, I clocked that in my mind and I was like,
Beware.
don't be the DJ that starts playing ghost artists on the radio.
How do you think, well, I guess actually just tell us this, like you are someone who hand curates music, but you do use Spotify. What is your average day of Spotify use? And do you think it's different than the way someone like me would use it?
I do think it's I use Spotify a lot, I'll be honest with you.
Okay.
It's kind of like it's an easy way for me to organize music. When I'm listening, like for example, every Friday there's like a lot of new music released. It's all in one place. I
Yeah.
can listen to it on the way into the
Yeah.
studio, and then I can just like the songs that I then want to download. And they're all right there. It's just like such a great tool for
So it's
me.
helpful for you as a DJ.
It's super helpful,
Huh.
especially as like a radio DJ. And I like to make playlists as well,
Yeah.
for my own use, like at home or for parties or whatever. But then also like even different. I make my own mood playlists.
You make your own.
Yeah, I mean, I
Oh,
don't
I
like
like that.
necessarily call it
Why
like.
aren't you sharing these, friend?
I do share them.
Okay.
I do. They're kind of like the moods are varied. They're not necessarily like ones for doing yoga too, but like I have one called Visions of a New World. And to me it's just music that feels like the possibility of a new world. Just in my mind, right?
Yeah.
But then also have like Brazilian music or whatever.
Yeah.
And so they're useful, like say if it's like Carnival is happening in Brazil and I want to play some music related to Carnival, then I'll go to like my Spotify playlist. It's just so easy
Yeah.
to have it. So I think that I use it in those ways. And I think that when you are a person who plays music for a living, you can't separate yourself as like just being a listener. Or at least I don't. Like I'm always thinking about what is music that I could play on the radio or at a party. So even if I'm listening just like for my own enjoyment, I'm thinking about
finding
my
a way.
people
Yeah.
that I'm gonna, play music for
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah. You have someone who some might argue is at odds with Spotify and what it's doing. Hand curation versus AI curation. What questions do you have for Novena? Knowing that she is more involved in this Spotify story than I am.
Yeah. Well, I think that talking to DJs, it's always really interesting, like to hear you talk about, what informs the way that you contextualize and present music, because I do think it's really important to have these moments of like remembering that receiving music recommendations that are sort of curated based on data and just like listening patterns is so different than these other kind of like richer kind of what I would say more meaningful ways of curating music. So it sounds like Spotify is a useful tool, but I would assume that it's not the only input that you're taking in, like in researching and contextualizing music. Like what are some of the other things that inform how you select music?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is totally like one of the tools.
Yeah.
And I also am really aware of not letting it become a tool that I use too much or where like unknowingly Spotify wraps me into like listening to or selecting mostly what they're suggesting to me, right? So well, for one, I kind of like create my own discovery experience sometimes in Spotify. So if there is like an artist that I'm listening to that I like that maybe was suggested, then I might use their tools and be like, create radio around this artist. You can do the radio option and then it will play like other artists like that or whatever. It's not necessarily like a discovery playlist, but it is probably something that's informed by their data or whatever.
Yeah.
But then then I'll be like, okay, let me find like a playlist that maybe has this artist's name in it or other things within the app. Just kind of take myself on an adventure. And then I'll go outside of it and I'll use tools like Bandcamp for sure. Bandcamp has cool radio that they create with different playlists that are curated by actual DJs
Okay.
and music tastemakers or sometimes just musicians. I am just like constantly listening. Like I said, it's like I'm never not listening for music that I can play or share with people. It could be in a movie, it could be at a bar, it could be at Sam Sanders' house. Or I listen to the other KCRW radio.
Yeah. I like that you're saying this, like what you're saying, and I think that what you're asking for, and I think what I want to pursue more as a Spotify user is for wherever you listen and however you listen to listen carefully and to acknowledge the people you're listening to. You're doing something that I think most people who use Spotify don't. You're taking note of every song you hear and you're acknowledging it. And you're saying, oh, this artist made that one. I hear this one. That is a song. Whereas so many of us get in that Spotify loop where it's endless playlists for hours and you don't think of the music you're hearing for hours. And so maybe that's like the big takeaway from this chat. It's like we can't all remove ourselves from Spotify, or we don't want to, but we can be better listeners. And I think what I'm taking for me as a challenge from this chat, and I'm challenging listeners and viewers too, is like, as you listen to Spotify and use it, you don't have to like not use it, but be aware of it and like take note of the next song and the next song. And if you like the song, go heart it. And if you want, I just found this out a year ago, you can go back and look at the queue of all the songs Spotify has played you. It'll show you. I didn't know that.
Wow, that's cool.
Do that. So yeah, it's like, it's funny. I think I came in here, pitchforks, burn the house down. And talking to both of you, I think it's like there's a world in which like we live with Spotify. We're just more aware of what it's doing to us.
Yeah. Or you like, just to be clear, like you can also build an MP3 library too. You have options, you know, you could do both.
Build an MP3 library myself.
I know, not
I'm just
everyone's
thinking
going to
about
like
how do I sync it with my car play.
I just like, you know, I'm big on, you know, remembering that alternatives are possible.
And all this reporting, I'm guessing you went to Spotify for statement and comment a lot, and I'm guessing that they were following what you were reporting on. What have they said to you throughout this whole process, writ large?
So I interviewed for my book over 100 people. I interviewed a lot of musicians. I interviewed former Spotify employees. I interviewed a lot of people who work for independent record labels, who worked in the music industry during the rise of streaming. I didn't do any official interviews with Spotify for this book, and one of the reasons for that is that I was really interested in telling a ground-up story, not a top-down one. So there are plenty of places online where you can find Spotify and Spotify executives telling the company's story from their perspective. You know, tons of media appearances by Daniel Ek, top executives that have happened, and I draw on those in my book. I've spent so many hours listening to these various Spotify executives talk, but I really wanted to use my precious 90,000 words to tell a different type of story.
Because Spotify has their own microphone. It's very big.
Yeah.
This is what I forgot to tell you. I was listening. This is funny. You'll both love this. I was listening to you on Switched on Pop, the music podcast from Vulture. Charlie Harding's a good friend of mine.
Cool.
And you were telling him the origin story of Spotify. And at one moment you're saying, yeah, it seems like these executives first began to float the idea at a birthday party for Martin Lawrenson. I heard Martin Lawrence.
Same! Me too!
I
was like, are you going to say that?
I was like, Martin Lawrence was involved in the creation of Spotify in Sweden?
I was like, why did he have a birthday party in Sweden? I was like, Martin!
And so now I have this like alternative creation story of Spotify in which Martin Lawrence pulled the strings.
I fully have that too. Like I pictured his face like,
like,
it's
let's
my
go.
birthday.
Music on demand. Anywho, I tell you.
That's really funny. Now, Martin Lawrenson and the co-founder, Martin Lawrenson, the co-founder of Spotify.
Okay. Spotify would be so much more fun if Martin Lawrence were involved. If you're listening, Martin and Spotify. So what I'm going to do after this chat is beef up my vinyl collection even more and work on my MP3 collection.
If you want.
Oh, I'm going to. It's happening.
I think like also being curious makes
Yeah.
the experience so much more interesting. Like if you like a song, then it's like go to their artist. If you're on Spotify,
just
go to their
check them
artist
out.
page, check out their bio. Who are they? Like it might even be cooler than you think it is. Like you find out that they're like actually an Indonesian R&B duo who are both, you know, one person's 19, the other person's 43.
Yeah.
And like they met in South Africa or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
there could be a
there's
story
so
there.
many cool stories out there. If you're a person who enjoys stories, I enjoy documentaries a lot. And it kind of like ties those two things together to have more context. And it also adds more richness to your life because you're like starting this relationship potentially with artists that you like. And then maybe you'll go see them live or you'll watch their music video and you can kind of recapture what is sometimes nostalgic of like really becoming a fan of an artist and creating something long lasting So then you can have like more meaningful music experiences, whether it's listening or
Yeah.
seeing them in person.
What you're saying is treat music like art, not a utility or commodity.
That's what I'm saying, Sam.
That's what she's saying.
That's what
Absolutely.
We've said so many great things. I want
Yeah.
to thank you both for being here. I
Thank
feel
you so
less
much.
pessimistic
Thank you.
about the state of music
I
and
mean- That's
good.
streaming.
Some people have told me that my book has left them feeling hopeful.
Some people have said.
Some
I
people
love
have
that.
said.
People say that about my show too.
There we go.
Amazing.
Hope in a book. Liz Pelly's book is called Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. And Novena Carmel makes perfect playlist every day here at
Yes.
KCRW. Thank you both. Sign the beach ball. So
Love
glad you were
to.
here.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. This was great.
course. You
Yeah, I
both.
really appreciate it.
There's a Sharpie right
Yes.
there. You got to sign it.
Oh, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, yeah. All right, we asked Spotify for a comment on the claims Liz Pelly raised in her book, and they got back to us and said, quote, "The book contains inaccuracies and misinformation throughout. Unfortunately, Spotify was not contacted for fact-checking, from which we could have helped clarify or even comment." End quote.